until the central bankers develop a theory of inflation, begin to understand what they're dealing with and actually tackle it. And that means actually rediscovering their inner monetarism, then this inflation will come.
Welcome back to Breakout with Breaking Views, brought to you by PGIM. I'm Peter Thal, the global editor of Breaking Views, coming to you this morning from northwest London. I'm talking to Edward Chancellor. Welcome back, Eddie. There's really only one topic of conversation for investors at the moment, and that's inflation and interest rates. We're recording this chat the morning after the Federal Reserve raised interest rates by 0.75 of a percentage point for the first time since 1994. The European Central Bank, the Bank of Japan, the Bank of England are also grappling with rising prices and what to do about it. But Eddie, you've been looking at another decade when central banks lost control of prices, the 1970s. So what lessons should we be learning from that period?
Well, so 1970s, the Fed obviously allowed what we call the Great Inflation to be unleashed. And there are certain things similar to today. The Fed was said to be very slow in reacting to the return of inflation, constantly behind the curve, increasing interest rates by only tiny increments. But I think more interested in sort of economic stability than inflation, worried about unemployment. I think when you look at how the Fed operated in the 1970s, it was under the leadership of a distinguished economist called Arthur Burns. And the thing about Burns is that he was not beholden to any sort of economic theory, and he paid no attention to the monetary aggregates, to the growth of the money supply. Now, I start my piece by saying, inflation is a complicated matter. There's no doubt about it, and we've written about that in the past. But in the end, all great inflations are reflected by a strong growth in the money supply. And all great inflations are become rooted when central bankers pay no attention to the money supply. And the best example, the most sort of laughable example, is the German hyperinflation, when the president of the Reichsbank, called Rudolf Haberstein, his money printers were working 24/7. And yet Haberstein continued to insist that actually the inflation was caused by the collapse in the mark on the foreign exchange, had nothing to do with money supply. Now go to the 1980s. It was only when Burns was replaced by Paul Volcker, and Paul Volcker said, I'm going to tackle this money supply problem and get the money supply under control, that actually the great inflation came to an end.
Yeah, so your point is really that people sort of lost sight of the money supply. And I mean, I guess you could argue something similar has happened now, right? We had in the 70s, people were still sort of looking at sort of the Keynesian framework and saying, well, inflation is a trade-off with unemployment. That broke down. Then we had the monetarists in the 1980s, although that also has sort of been a bit sort of left behind. So, I mean, one of the problems seems to be they don't really have a theory of inflation at the moment.
Well, that's what Charles Goodhart, the sort of grand old man of British monetary economics, said the other day. Now, monetarism, this sort of theory that links inflation to changes in money supply, is not as easy as it appears. It's very difficult to know what money is. Goodhart himself showed that there's no stable relationship between measures of the money supply and inflation itself. But that doesn't really get away from the fundamental truth that inflation is a monetary phenomenon and could only occur if the money supply is growing strongly. Now, today, as Goodhart says, monetarism is so discredited that the central bankers don't mention the monetary aggregates. Christine Lagarde at the ECB press conference the other day, there was absolutely no mention of monetary aggregates. When Governor Bailey of the Bank of England was denying that the Bank of England was responsible for Britain's cost of living crisis, he made no reference to the fact that the money supply had increased massively when the Bank of England printed hundreds of billions of dollars during the COVID lockdowns. Instead, and here we get back to the energy crisis, Bailey and the others are saying, well, don't blame us look at the look at the rising price of oil. Well, and then in particular look at Putin's invasion of Ukraine. Well, there are two things about that. First of all, the oil was actually at $100 a barrel before Putin's tanks rolled over the border. But the other thing is, and this is a point that Milton Friedman, the great monetarist, made in the 1970s, is that inflation the rise in the oil price in itself should only cause a shift in relative prices. More gas in your tank, less bread on your table. It can't in itself create a rise in the overall price level. That has to be due to the fact that the central bankers have allowed things to get out of hand.
Yeah. So do you see the focus on the money supply and monetarism, let's we say, so do you see that making a comeback as people try to get to grips with this phenomenon?
Yeah, but slowly. I mean, this is the problem, is that I suggest in my piece that really until the central bankers develop a theory of inflation, begin to understand what they're dealing with and actually tackle it, and that means actually rediscovering their inner monetarism, then this inflation will come. It won't go in a straight line. As I cite, the monetarists now saying that US money supply is coming down a bit, so we could get an inflation shock on the downside next. But the point is that until it took almost 10 years for the errors of monetary policy in the 1970s to be realized and a new, stricter, more monetarist approach to be imposed. And I'm suggesting that we are in for a long haul. Now, from an investment perspective, think of it, the great inflation of the 70s saw inflation in the US average around 7.5%. I'm saying off the top of my head that break-even inflation expectations are sort of in the range of 2.5% to 3% nowadays. They may have moved in the last couple of days, but they're sort of less than half the great inflation of the 1970s. And I think that pricing is wrong. I think we're going to discover over the course of this decade that we're a lot more like the 70s, possibly worse, but certainly or certainly in my view, not close to what the market's currently expecting.
Okay, Eddie, fascinating as always. Thank you so much, and talk to you again soon.